Bonjour, bienvenue à toutes et tous à l'Assemblée nationale. Je suis ravie de vous recevoir aujourd'hui. Je suis Gabrielle Catala, députée du Val d'Oise et membre du groupe d'amitié France-Palestine à l'Assemblée nationale. Merci à Céline d'avoir organisé avec nous cette conférence. J'ai le plaisir d'aujourd'hui d'accueillir dans ce panel pas du tout paritaire plusieurs grands éminents chercheurs sur la question des grands juristes ou chercheurs de renommée sur la question du Moyen-Orient et plus spécifiquement sur la question de la Palestine. Et donc j'ai juste à ma gauche monsieur Mouin Rabbani, chercheur spécialiste du Moyen-Orient. Ensuite, au milieu, monsieur Camille Mansour, qui a été le doyen de la faculté de Birzeit, si je prononce bien, en Cisjordanie. Ensuite, nous avons monsieur William Schabas, que nombreux d'entre vous connaissent ici dans cette salle, puisque je crois que c'est votre professeur, qui est conseiller auprès de l'Arab Renaissance qui est professeur de droit international, spécialiste de la question des génocides, qui a écrit de très nombreux articles de recherche sur le sujet de nombreux ouvrages. Et enfin, monsieur Lex Takkenberg, également professeur à l'Institute of Humanitarian Affairs de l'université Fordham, qui a travaillé pendant de très nombreuses années pour l'UNRWA et qui a notamment coécrit un ouvrage avec Francesca Albanese, mais je leur laisserai chacun mieux se présenter. Alors aujourd'hui, nous avons divers sujets que nous allons examiner avec eux. Le premier, c'est, évidemment, le fil conducteur, c'est le crime de génocide en droit international et son importance au regard de la situation à Gaza. Les liens entre les crimes commis à Gaza et la CIJ et la CPI, le fameux Conseil de la paix qui est un plan colonial de Donald Trump et sa phase 2 qui a été lancée, l'avenir et la situation de l'UNRWA et des ONG internationales qui ont été interdites par Israël, puisque 35 ONG auraient dû donner le nom de leur staff palestiniens, ce qui a été refusé notamment par MSF et d'autres, et donc elles sont donc interdites d'opérer à Gaza. Pardon. Donc on va commencer par une introduction de monsieur Camille Mansour qui va parler anglais. Ensuite on enchaînera avec monsieur William Schabas qui va nous parler plus spécifiquement des crimes pardon parce que j'ai des allergies commis à Gaza et de ce qu'on peut en dire, de ce que le travail que fait la CIJ, notamment la décision qui a été rendue en janvier 2024 qui parlait déjà de risque génocidaire, et la décision de juillet 2024 qui en fait a reconnu la situation coloniale et d'apartheid et les crimes commis par Israël et qui enjoignait Israël de quitter définitivement les territoires occupés. Et il nous dira un mot aussi sur la procédure en cours auprès de la CPI, puisqu'il y a toujours les deux mandats d'arrêt qui frappent Benjamin Netanyahou et Yoav Gallant, son ancien ministre de la Défense. Ensuite, nous poursuivrons avec monsieur Lex Takkenberg qui évoquera la situation de l'UNRWA et l'interdiction qui a été faite aux ONG internationales d'opérer à Gaza et en Cisjordanie. Donc ça, là aussi, ça interroge puisque certaines ONG continuent à opérer, donc elles seront directement complices malheureusement d'Israël, et ça veut dire ça signifie qu'elles vont donner l'identité de tout leur personnel palestinien à l'État d'Israël. Et nous terminerons par monsieur Mouin Rabbani qui évoquera le Conseil de la paix de Trump et la situation actuelle à Gaza. Je sens plus tarder, je vais donc laisser la parole à monsieur Camille Mansour.
Thank you. Well, I had prepared in French, but I'm invited to talk into English. I'm ready to do this. Maybe there will be some hesitation at some points, but I will try to avoid these limitations. First of all, I would like to thank Madame la députée Gabrielle Catala for the opportunity to talk, to present today, to present the context of the points of the questions, the issues that will be raised by my three colleagues here. And my three colleagues that I would like to say, to whom I would say hello. I think the context could be seen in two ways, or in two dimensions. One, the Palestinian-Israeli space, and the other one is the French space, or more broadly, the European space. First, let me start with the Palestinian-Israeli context, or Palestinian-Israeli space. In this context, which goes or this space, which goes from the river to the sea, violations of international law have been perpetrated. Crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. These violations will be described, presented by my colleagues. But I would like to make 3 or 4 points on this. First of all, these violations don't go back to October 2023. They are much older. They don't go back to 1993 with the Oslo agreements. They don't go back only to 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And they go back to 1948. I don't know who among you read the newspaper Haaretz. 10 days ago, Haaretz has published a piece from Adam Raz, which is whose title, the title of was "Terror was needed to make Arabs leave. What the army did in 1948 revealed." That was, in Haaretz on the 27th of February, and yesterday also there was a evocation of this crime against humanity at the time, in 1948. Second, the violations have not ceased with the ceasefire that was attained in October 2025. More than 500 Palestinians have been killed since October, after the ceasefire, and more than 1,400 injured. The majority of the victims are civilians, women, old people, children. The genocide, the active genocide, could be temporarily interrupted, but all the other violations continue. They are ongoing, whether in the West Bank, or whether in Gaza or the West Bank. Third, everything shows that the ethnic cleansing of Gaza is still in the agenda of the Israeli extreme right government. As long as the Israeli troops occupy between 50 and 60% of the Gaza territory, and as long as there has been no reconstruction, no huge reconstruction started, well, the expulsion of the Palestinians in Gaza is always in the agenda, unfortunately. Everything shows that the Israeli government seeks wherever it can to make irreversible facts in Palestine, benefiting from the dynamics of the war, benefiting, for instance, now of the war on Iran, on Lebanon, and benefiting from the support of the US government and the less than neutral position of Europe, including France. Fourth, the media have, during the last 30 years, talked about crimes perpetuated by individuals Israelis, whether soldiers or settlers. Crimes which appear as being gratuitous acts, des crimes gratuits, or acts that could be explained by a desire for revenge, un désir de vengeance. The questions that I would like to raise now. The fact is, Israeli justice system doesn't, in most cases, I don't know, 90% or more than 90% of cases, doesn't, the government, the person who are in charge, do not apprehend all those people, these individuals, who perpetrate crimes that appear to be gratuitous. That means, most probably, they enjoy the comprehensive attitude, l'attitude compréhensive, the comprehensive attitude of the Israeli leaders. But could we not go beyond this and say that they are encouraged and serve the political objective of the ongoing political objective of ethnic cleansing, or at least to put the Palestinians, whether in Gaza and Strip, under submission. That is, the context in Palestine, in the Israeli-Palestinian space. Let me talk about now the context in France. Facing these serious developments in the Palestinian-Israeli space, the French response has been deceiving and preoccupying, décevante et préoccupante. In the best of cases, in France, we suffice ourselves to affirm that we respect the decisions of the judicial instances in the ICJ or ICC, but without taking any steps as to follow up a theoretical position. And if when we want to act, or somebody wants to act, or a French leader wants to act, the action is made in order to détourner l'attention, to divert the attention of. And all of you probably have heard 2 weeks ago concerning our friend Francesca Albanese. What does it serve? It hurts her, but also it serves to forget what's happening in Gaza. The main objective is for us, for the listeners in the media, to forget what's happening in Gaza. The media have played a negative role concerning the French position, the French political position. I have a strong sentiment that there is no compass. There is no compass in the foreign policy of France. Unless, I fear, a certain implicit compass has been revived, which is the revival of a colonial reaction. Implicit, sometimes explicit, colonial reaction of what's happening in Palestine. As for public opinion, in my mind, I see public opinion is in favor of Palestinian rights. But the problem is probably, it is possible, and that's why we are here, possible that now public opinion is crossing a period of discouragement. In front of what's happening in Palestine, the responsibility of states is here. We can talk about the Geneva Convention, which is Article 1 of Geneva Convention, imposes on states to intervene when there are violations of the force in Geneva Convention. I will give you another example. I mean, my friends will give you examples on this from ICG or whatever, ICC. But in 2005, there was a huge summit at the UN, attended by numerous heads of state. A world summit after, the tragedies in the Balkan and Rwanda. And this world summit took a resolution under 60/1, affirming the responsibility of the international community to protect the people's populations against genocide, against war crimes, against ethnic cleansing, and against crimes against humanity. Have we heard during the last 3 years that somebody at the UN, whether members, permanent members, the 5, or other temporary members, have called for coming back to this world declaration, which is known as R2P, protection, responsibility to protect, R2P? Nothing has happened. The responsibility of states is today more important today because of the norms and world rules that are being put aside by great powers, especially by the US. The norms that have evolved, the rules taking the form of treaties, of international law, since 1945, developing in the 60s with the right of self-determination for people who were colonized. All this progress that has been made in international rules is being now put aside. And Palestine is paying, among others, the price of this evolution where we don't know what will be the rules tomorrow, what will be the international rules tomorrow. The presentation that we made today do not constitute an academic or intellectual exercise concerning how to qualify Israeli practices. They have to be considered as a message which calls to put a term to violations, to the ongoing violations, and to prevent the risk of violations to come. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Deputy Catala, for inviting us and organizing this event here in the Assemblée Nationale. I feel very honored to be in this building, in this place, and to be seated also with such distinguished colleagues to talk about these important issues. It has become very not uncommon in recent days and weeks to say that international law is dead, that international law is finished, that there's no longer any international law. I think that it's clear that there are a few states who are absolutely defiant of international law. Israel, to start with, the United States of America. There are a few of their friends who have trouble articulating this. I saw that the German Chancellor made a statement about the attack on Iran, suggesting that maybe we could put international law aside for a while. You know, the last time the German head of state did that was in 1939, and that didn't end well. And the last time before that, a German head of state said that was in 1914, and that didn't end well either. But most states will not say those things. The vast majority of states in the world are law-abiding. They don't commit aggression. They believe in international law. Saying that international law doesn't exist because there are a few states that flagrantly violate it, it would be like saying that criminal law doesn't exist in Paris anymore because a few bandits robbed the Louvre. And that's not, that's obviously not a sensible proposition. I don't think there's maybe any better example of why international law is not dead and why so many states actually respect and want to defend and abide by international law is the fact that so many of them go to the International Court of Justice to address problems that they see as being of great importance. There is a very, very dramatic turn towards the International Court of Justice, the World Court, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, according to the Charter. It's been the last half dozen years, roughly, 5-6 years. If we tried to put a date on it, I think maybe it started when the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2017 asked the International Court of Justice to rule on the lawfulness of the British theft of the Chagos Islands from Mauritius. And then that led, a year or two later, to an application by the Gambia alleging that Myanmar was committing genocide, and that followed with other cases. Several cases that have some common features about them. So the first, I mentioned this advisory opinion on the Chagos Islands, which was delivered in early 2019. But there have been, of course, two important advisory opinions delivered in the last few years about Palestine. And reference was made to the first of them by Deputy Catala in her introduction, the advisory opinion of the 19th of July 2024 that declared that the occupation of Palestine was unlawful and that it had to end quickly. And there was a subsequent advisory opinion issued last year, and I think Lex is going to speak about this a little bit, or about the consequences about the expulsion by Israel of UNRWA in particular from Israel. And these advisory opinions are important because you need to get a large majority in the United Nations General Assembly to request them. And you can get that because states want those questions to be answered by judges who are applying international law. And I think that in those two advisory opinions dealing with Palestine, the judges did a pretty fine job, really. It was a wonderful achievement, as was, by the way, the advisory opinion that they issued about the Chagos Islands, and the British have now agreed to return the Chagos Islands. They've reached agreement to return them to their rightful owners, the government of the people of Mauritius and the people of the Chagos Islands above all. The other thing, of course, that's been going on is states have been going to the International Court of Justice to litigate cases that don't concern them directly. In international law, we talk about injured states. These are not injured states. So when Gambia goes to the International Court of Justice about allegations of genocide in Myanmar, Gambia has nothing to do with Myanmar, really. Gambia is acting in the common interest. So this is something, we have a Latin term we use in international law. We call these erga omnes cases. And it's something that we wrote about in textbooks and we lectured about in the classroom, but that actually didn't happen. until very recently. And now it's happening. So we have that case, and then we have, of course, of more direct interest to our subject today, the case that was filed by South Africa in December of 2023, charging Israel with committing genocide. And then that was followed only months later by another case filed by Nicaragua against Germany, not charging Israel with genocide, but charging Germany with complicity in genocide and failure to prevent genocide. So these were cases that were filed by states that were not interested in the case in a direct sense, that were not injured in a direct sense, but they were taking up the common interest. And to that, we have to also add the fact that many, many states have intervened in these cases at the International Court of Justice. In the case of Gambia and Myanmar, I think there were 11 states that intervened, and now in the case of South Africa versus Israel, we have more like 15, I think, that have intervened. We may have a few more this week before the week is through, because this is the deadline this week. They never did this before. Never in the history of the International Court of Justice. There had been a handful of interventions in everything the International Court of Justice had done until 3-4 years ago. And now we have scores of them intervening in the cases because they want the issues to be settled in a court of law by judges applying international law. International law isn't dead, that's for sure, and that's the proof of it. So let me talk a little bit about these cases, mainly the South African case, and I'll say a few words also about the case that Nicaragua has filed against Germany. And just for full transparency, I am involved directly in those cases. I've been working with the state of Palestine on its intervention in the case between South Africa and Israel, and I've been working with Nicaragua in its case filed against Germany. The South African case, but let me just back up a minute. They have a history together. I said that South Africa is not an injured state, but they have a history with Israel. It's kind of interesting, and I'm just going to say a few words about it. If you go way back to the beginning of the United Nations, the very beginning, when the General Assembly started to meet in 1946, the first human rights issues that were taken up, among the first human rights issues taken up by the General Assembly of the United Nations, was racism in South Africa. And there was actually a resolution proposed by India in the General Assembly in 1946 that India managed to get adopted over the objections of the states, basically of the North, who were all friends of South Africa. And then a few years later, 1952, I think, there was a resolution of the General Assembly calling for a commission of inquiry to do a report on apartheid in South Africa. It's the first time that it ever happened, to have a commission of inquiry, a human rights fact-finding mission. We have loads of them now, but this was the first. And it was a vote where the states of the South voted in favor, the states of the North voted against. You mentioned the boussole, the compass, France's compass. France can uses a compass, because a compass tells us where the North is and where the South is. And France voted on that one with the North. You're probably not surprised, 1952. All of the Europeans did. But Israel voted in favor of the resolution. Israel voted with the South. That was in 1952. And from time to time, in the decade or so that followed, Israel would actually vote anti-apartheid resolutions. I think that the former Prime Minister, Golda Meir, was once challenged by the Knesset about this, and she said, you know, we're a state where our people suffered so much from racism and racial discrimination. How could we not side with the South Africans fighting racial discrimination in South Africa? They got to a point in the mid-1960s where they had downgraded their diplomatic relations between Israel and South Africa to a consular level. They didn't even have ambassadors. And then it all changed. in 1967, when Israel swallowed that poisonous pill of occupied territory. And very quickly, the relationship changed, and Israel became South Africa's best friend in the world. At such a point that, so none of you remember this, of course, but I can remember when people traveled from, if you traveled from Europe or North America to South Africa, apartheid South Africa, you could not fly over Africa. You had to fly around Africa. And the planes had to refuel, and they would refuel, if you were coming from the west, on the Cape Verde Islands, which belonged to another racist colonial power, Portugal, or they would fly around and they would refuel in Tel Aviv on the way to Israel. South Africa almost got a nuclear weapon. I mean, Israel's against proliferation of nuclear arms in some parts of the world, but they were not against it when it came to South Africa, and they assisted South Africa in obtaining the capacity to have nuclear weapons. So they were one of the last friends, I want to say to desert South Africa, but they were there loyal to the end. So they have this history together, and I'm sure that it's part of the conversation, and it's part of the emotions that the South Africans feel in taking up this noble, heroic stand they've done by picking a fight with not only a powerful military country, but one that has an even more powerful, nasty friend, the United States of America. So this case was filed by South Africa, and then quite quickly, South Africa was able to obtain what we call a provisional measures order. The first one was delivered at the end of January of 2024. Reference was made to this as well. And it showed that the case, and people quibble about what exactly the terms were, but it showed that this was a serious case. And there were orders to Israel that, of course, Israel has not complied with, but they did change so many things, even just to give a somewhat banal example. In my world, which is the university classroom, until the end of January 2024, you could get in serious problems if you were in a university, if you were a university lecturer, saying the G word, talking about genocide in Israel, about Israel committing genocide. For my younger colleagues, this could be a career-ending move. I'm not really worried about the end of my career. I'm there, okay? So I wasn't threatened by this. But many younger colleagues were threatened by it and just quietly decided to withdraw and not stick their head above the parapet, as we say. But this has changed, and that judgment had a huge impact on our ability to talk about what Israel has been doing in Gaza. It was followed by two other provisional measures orders. Several states have intervened, as I mentioned, including Palestine. The latest one, a bit of I shouldn't say a surprise, but it came only a week or so ago, and there may be a few more coming, and this is from Paraguay. So Paraguay, we'll get a resolution in the General Assembly where all the countries will vote something positive and progressive, except for a small handful, usually grouped around Israel and the United States, and then a few Pacific Island states like the Marshall Islands and the Palau and one or two others, and Paraguay. So Paraguay submitted their statement last week. You could read it. We were debating, who would have written that, what international lawyer in Paraguay would have written it. We assume it probably wasn't written in Paraguay. It was probably written somewhere else and just delivered to them, and they've submitted it. There may be a few more to go in. The reason is that Israel now has a deadline of this week when it has to submit its answer to the South African case. So South Africa's case, of course, was filed in detail 2 years ago, in October of 2024, a year and a half ago. And then Israel had 9 months to reply, and they've asked for successive extensions of that, which they've been granted by the court. But now their time is up, and they have to either submit, I say submitted, I'm not I'm not 100% certain they will, because I wouldn't put it past them to say, we're walking away, we're not going to participate in this. They could do that. Others have done it. But I think it's more likely that they will contest it, so they'll submit it. And that means that the intervening states have to play their cards, have to declare themselves as interveners by this week as well. So that's Paraguay. There may be a few more. Maybe Palau will submit one, and maybe the Marshall Islands will submit one. We shall see. So this is what's happening with the case. I've described it before in media and elsewhere as being the strongest genocide case ever to come before the International Court of Justice. There have been many. This is, I think, the 19th application based on the Genocide Convention. Nobody has been successful in convicting. It's not really the proper term in international, public international law, but in having a state found to be responsible for committing genocide to date. So it's an uphill struggle. It's not straightforward. The law is very demanding. We had last month, or a little more than a month ago, in January, we had 3 weeks of hearings in the Myanmar case. We will have a judgment at the end of this year in the Myanmar case, or early next year. And that case will set the tone for what's going to happen in the South Africa case. I think that the stars are aligned now for a judgment by a court that is more liberal and has a more expansive view of the Genocide Convention and of the definition of genocide than its predecessors. First of all, the previous judgments, which were issued 11 years ago in 2015 and 2007, there are only a few judges who were on the court then who are still on the court. So it's a new generation of judges. We've seen from their writings in the advisory opinions and in the provisional measures orders that they are that they have an open mind on this, and so I think those are positive signals. But in some ways it's too early to tell how you cannot predict the outcome of this. I think that if Gambia wins the case against Myanmar, I don't think South Africa could lose. I think. If Gambia loses, though, I wouldn't say that South Africa has lost, because the case is much, much stronger, made up of many different elements, not only the punishable acts of genocide, killing, imposing conditions of life calculated to destroy the group, but also the elements that point to genocidal intent, including, because it's not exclusive to this, the outrageous statements by Israeli politicians that continue to this day, actually. Those statements and other messages, plus the whole strategy of creating a greater Israel that goes at least from the river to the sea and maybe even beyond, according to their ambitions. Now, let me just say a couple of words about the case that Nicaragua has filed, and a few words also just about the International Criminal Court. The case that Nicaragua has filed, Nicaragua sort of hesitated a year ago because they said that they wanted to do the case, but the cost was just too much for them, and they sort of recovered from that. And so they have made their submissions, and Germany has challenged it. Countries can make a preliminary challenge saying that the court doesn't have jurisdiction. Israel didn't do that in the South Africa case, but Germany has done that. And a few weeks ago, we had the deadline for Nicaragua to reply to Germany, which they've done, and there will be either a decision by the court without a hearing, or perhaps there'll be a hearing at some point in the next, say, 6 months on that issue. We'll see if the case will survive. There are some technical legal issues that I won't go into, but again, it was very, Nicaragua, incidentally, did send letters and threatened to take other countries to court, and they decided for various reasons that they would focus on Germany as a great friend of Israel, and they have also a substantial case, but it's at a preliminary stage, and we'll have to see if it survives this challenge. And then finally, at the International Criminal Court, as you know, we have 2 arrest warrants issued against Netanyahu and Gallant. We have had Netanyahu has traveled a little bit. He went to Hungary, and the Hungarian government defended him. I don't think he will come here. I know there were confusing messages from the French government at the time when the arrest warrant was issued. And I think, again, if you don't mind me picking on the German chancellor, I mean, why not? He made a statement as well recently about how he would make sure that Netanyahu wasn't arrested if he came to Germany. And, you know, it's like the case in France or in Britain. These are countries that have a functioning justice system. The head of state doesn't decide who gets to be arrested and who doesn't get to be arrested. It's not their job. And as I reminded a German journalist recently, that the last time you had a head of state who could guarantee someone wouldn't be arrested was in 1945, when Hitler was committed suicide. So those are the 2 outstanding warrants. There may be others. And so one of the things that happened at the International Criminal Court after those arrest warrants were issued and after they were made public is that the judges said to the prosecutor, you're not supposed to make this public. We'll decide when something goes public. So it's a bit frustrating for us because we'd like to be able to say this politician or that politician is Smotrich is wanted and Ben Gvir is wanted by the ICC. We can't do that because we don't know. But that's okay because maybe they don't know either. I don't know how useful all of this is because I don't think you could really keep such a thing entirely secret. The International Criminal Court is one of the features of international criminal courts, not just this one, goes right back to Nuremberg, is that they do attract spies. And there are lots of spies in and around the International Criminal Court. So when I say I don't think that Ben Gvir and Smotrich would be caught by surprise exactly because I suspect that there are spies out there. But there may be many more arrest warrants in preparation at the International Criminal Court. And there, the big challenge, of course, is getting custody over the offenders because the court can't really proceed until they have arrested them. There, in a nutshell, this is the 15, 17-minute version of these issues. Of course, it would take many hours to do justice to all the details in the cases. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. No, you can hear me, right? Yes. So, thank you, Deputy Catala, for the opportunity to join and address this important gathering here in the Assemblée Nationale. Thank you to the other speakers to be able to join you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will use my 15 minutes or so for a few comments about the Israeli attack against UNRWA, the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, which I had the privilege of serving for 3 decades. Madam Catala already mentioned that. And against the group of international NGOs operating in the occupied Palestinian territory and that have recently also come under significant attack. Those attacks have in common that they hamper the delivery of critical education and medical services, in addition to life-saving emergency humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this is happening in flagrant violation of international law. And I will show that there is a sort of a clear coherence in the rationale by Israel for attacking both. To start with UNRWA, a subsidiary organ of the UN, established in late 1949, upon the initiative of the US to contain the Palestinian refugee question after it, the US, as chair of the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, failed to achieve the return of the refugees as required by international law as it stood at the time and demanded by the UN General Assembly. After an initial focus on large-scale work schemes in an attempt to integrate the refugees into the host countries, UNRWA gradually became the organization that we know today, a provider of public services, basic education, vocational training, comprehensive primary healthcare services, relief and social services, protection, and emergency humanitarian assistance in times of crisis. In 1967, when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, it immediately requested UNRWA to continue its operations in the newly occupied territories. Although Israel repeatedly criticized UNRWA almost from the beginning, for example, over alleged anti-Semitism in textbooks used in the agency's schools, or over staff engagement with paramilitary groups, until the arrival of the current Israeli government, it never demanded the agency's closure. This dramatically changed after the brutal Hamas attacks of 7 October 2023. Following as yet unsubstantiated allegations that a number of UNRWA staff had been involved in the attacks, the Israeli government initiated a campaign aimed at discrediting and ultimately dismantling the agency. In October 2024, the Knesset adopted 2 laws, and a year later a third one that closed UNRWA schools and clinics in East Jerusalem and greatly impacted the agency's operations in Gaza and the remainder of the West Bank. It also initiated a massive disinformation campaign around the world aimed at convincing donors to defund the agency. Reference was already made to the recent attacks against Francesca Albanese, triggered by a doctored video clip by the pro-Israeli organization UN Watch. UN Watch has for years also been sort of trying to discredit UNRWA and also dramatically stepped up these efforts after the onset of the current Israeli government. And these attempts by Israel to hamper its operations and to close it down were brought upon the initiative of Norway, actually, to the International Court of Justice. Professor Schabas already referred to it for an advisory opinion, and the court ruled in October of last year that essentially Israel's obstruction of UNRWA violates international law, and that none of the allegations that Israel had made had been underpinned with evidence to merit the action that Israel had taken. Now, Israel had justified legislative and other measures by reference to UNRWA's alleged attack of neutrality and engagement of its employees in terrorist acts, allegations that were found without merit ultimately by the ICJ, by the Court of Justice, and previously, before that, by 2 independent reviews, including one led by former French Foreign Minister Colonna, and So the fact that these arguments made no sense gradually revealed the real reason for the Israeli attacks, which has been to sort of erase the underlying purpose of UNRWA's mandate, the protection of Palestine refugees' right of return and the international community's permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine, including the unresolved refugee crisis since the Nakba in 1948. In essence, Israel has been trying to erase the Palestinian refugee question once and for all. And this is happening in the context of its genocidal onslaught in the Gaza Strip and the escalating ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. In this frame, institutions mandated to support Palestinians to survive the ongoing process of forceful erasure are deemed or seen as enemies of Israel. This applies to UNRWA, but also very much to the international NGOs working in Palestine. Both are sort of the eyes and ears of the international community on the ground in Palestine. All the more important when international journalists have been denied entry to the Gaza Strip. Today, apart from East Jerusalem, where UNRWA's schools and clinics were closed down, UNRWA continues to operate in both Gaza and the remainder of the West Bank through its local workforce, comprised of some 11,000 employees in Gaza and 4,000 in the West Bank, who continue to provide a lifeline to the refugees during the ongoing genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank under extremely difficult circumstances. And I'm sure you have read in the media that more than 300 Palestinian UNRWA colleagues in Gaza alone have lost their life and many more injured since October 23. In Gaza, UNRWA today continues to provide health care through the health centers that survived the genocide so far, but also improvised health points that UNRWA established. And with that large local force, one of the things that UNRWA has always been able to do is, whenever an emergency broke out, to turn its regular education and health and relief operations, to turn them into an emergency mode. So UNRWA has been a critical organization in helping to provide emergency health care, psychosocial support to the children under the genocide that is now 2.5 years going on. Some basic learning activities, both in person and also through online means to the extent that internet coverage is available. Food assistance, UNRWA, it's been very difficult or almost impossible for UNRWA to directly import food because of the Israeli bans, but then in partnership with other UN agencies, and because it has the huge infrastructure and the staff that have the trust of the refugees, UNRWA continues the main actual provider of food aid in the Gaza Strip. Wash support, sanitation, water, wastewater management, and under the very difficult circumstances, and provide and supply of drinking water, tanked drinking water. In the West Bank, the situation is a little bit better. Most of UNRWA's schools and health centers and other services are operating fairly normally, with the exclusion of East Jerusalem, which is also part of the West Bank, and also taking into consideration that since 7 October, Israel carried out major operations in the north of the West Bank that dramatically affected the refugee camps of Jenin, Tulkarem, Nur Shams, and as a result of which roughly 30,000 Palestinian refugees were uprooted. So if I say fairly normal, it means that the schools and health centers in the other camps and around the affected camps still operate. The operational challenges that UNRWA is facing are compounded by an unprecedented financial crisis that for a number of reasons is much more serious than those faced previously. It prompted UNRWA's Commissioner General earlier this year to reduce operations and salaries by some 20%. Schools have gone from 5 days per week to 4 days per week, the same for health centers. And this has never happened in the agency's 75 years history. And as these measures only address part of the financial gap, and there are no real prospect for significant additional funding, there is a serious risk of a disorderly collapse of UNRWA during the second half of this year. The collapse of UNRWA and even the reduction of UNRWA services would lead to dire consequences for the people of Gaza, nearly half of whom are children. It may even lead, as Egypt has warned, to mass displacement from Gaza due to service collapse. The loss of UNRWA services would heighten the risk of recruitment into extremist networks in the absence of UNRWA schools and youth engagement, and the breakdown of UNRWA's health and sanitation services could trigger public health threats beyond the refugee population. These consequences do not yet take into account the impact of the ongoing Israeli-US war against Iran, which will further complicate UNRWA's efforts to raise additional funding in the face of this unprecedented financial crisis. And of course, beyond Gaza, UNRWA also provides critical services in the West Bank, I already mentioned those, as well as Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, which would be equally impacted by UNRWA's collapse or further reduction of services. So, unfortunately, a pretty bleak picture. Let me finally make a few remarks about the recently introduced measures against a group of international NGOs. Israel imposed a compliance deadline requiring 37 international humanitarian organizations to hand detailed biodata of Palestinian staff and their families to Israeli security authorities as a condition for continued operations. 24 other organizations, mostly faith-based, compliant, and were approved. The 37 that refused, with the argument that the requirements subjected their employees to danger and violated EU data protection obligations, faced expulsion by the 1st of March. From a legal perspective, Israel has no authority to regulate humanitarian operations inside occupied territory. That authority rests with the Palestinian authorities under international humanitarian law. But as with so many other aspects of Israel's conduct, the agency has simply, or the state has simply ignored it. Just before the ban went into effect, the end of February, Israel's Supreme Court has temporarily frozen the order, but the underlying strategy of dismantlement through attrition continues. So what is at stake there? Those 37 international NGOs provide over 50% of food assistance, support 60% of field hospitals, and supply treatment for children with severe acute malnutrition. The alternative to those NGOs, along the example of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation model, we have seen was disastrous. It saw over 1,100 Palestinians killed at its distribution sites between May and September of last year, when their operation discontinued. Trump's plan, and Mouin will elaborate on that, foresees a national committee for the administration of Gaza, which may also take on, or is expected to take on, a humanitarian role. But this body has still not entered Gaza and is therefore as yet unable to provide any kind of relief. Israel has blocked its entry, and as of early March there was no timeline for entry. And now, since the start of the war in Iran, Gaza's crossings are once again closed, compounding the INGO supply freeze, a double chokehold on humanitarian access. So, in conclusion, what can parliamentarians do? What can people in Europe do? What must they do? Just a few suggestions or a few points. They can demand that Israel immediately reopen all crossings. The crossing closure is collective punishment, compounding the UNRWA and INGO ban. They should call on governments to formally state that the UNRWA and INGO ban and crossing closures together constitute flagrant violations of obligations under international humanitarian law, and I would add the Genocide Convention. They should call on the government to step up its support for UNRWA, both politically and financially, and speak out forcefully against the disinformation campaign against UNRWA and the INGO. Helping to set the record straight is the minimum all of us can contribute to, also ordinary citizens, students, professionals, journalists, setting the record straight is an absolute critical requirement. And finally, it should be possible to use the Iran crisis diplomatically. The government may link crossing reopening and sustaining UNRWA and INGOs to any regional stabilization engagement that might be happening once the current war comes to an end. Let me leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you very much, Deputy Katala, also for organizing this event. I'd like to speak briefly about the so-called Trump Initiative for the Gaza Strip and the associated Board of Trump, also known as the Board of Peace. The Trump Initiative was unveiled in September 2025, and the key factor leading to it was, in my view, not anything that Israel was doing in the Gaza Strip, but rather what Israel was increasingly doing in the region. And I think the key event was the Israeli bombing of the Qatari capital, Doha, previously. And we had seen that Arab governments seemed to be able to peacefully coexist with Israel slaughtering Palestinians in their own homeland, but drew the line at the regional expansion of Israel's regional campaign, particularly when it appeared that the United States was prepared to authorize or acquiesce in one of its regional client states, Israel, bombing the capital of another, Qatar. On the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, a number of Arab leaders and leaders of Muslim majority states met with Trump, said, we have to put this to an end. We can't have it on our daily headlines anymore. And they thereafter worked out a 21-point initiative that dealt essentially with three phases. The first, the immediate issue, suspension of hostilities, exchange of captives, surge in humanitarian assistance, and a limited withdrawal of Israeli forces within the Gaza Strip. The second issue dealt with, let's say, post-war governance and administration in the Gaza Strip, and issues of Palestinian decommissioning or disarmament. And the third, in the most vague manner imaginable, dealt with the broader political issues, the crisis that produced the crisis, if you will. And on this, essentially, nothing was said. There's barely even a recognition that a political horizon is required. Thereafter, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu parachuted into Washington, managed to get the initiative reduced from 21 to 20 points, and his key achievements were removing any reference to the West Bank from the initiative, and also removing that clause in the initial agreement that called for an Israeli commitment to not again bomb the Qatari capital, Doha. The initiative was unveiled in a joint White House press conference between Trump and Netanyahu, at the end of which Trump announced that a board of peace would be established with himself as the head. Most journalists present and analysts who wrote about it afterwards essentially viewed it as a kind of yet another Trump vanity project that wouldn't last much longer, and no one really took it seriously at the time because it seemed almost to be an afterthought. But then we saw several things happen. First of all, the deadline for the Nobel Peace Prize was approaching, and Trump exercised a lot of pressure, particularly on Netanyahu, to reach an agreement with Hamas before that deadline. And indeed, on the 8th of October of 2025, an Israeli-Palestinian agreement was reached, but it dealt only with the first phase of the initiative, meaning only the immediate issues I previously mentioned. Trump didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he had to suffice with the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize presented to him by the obsequious sycophant, or as I like to call him, the dirty, rotten scoundrel, Gianni Infantino. The next phase in this was at the Davos gathering of the rich and objectionable in early January, where Trump spoke about these issues. And here we saw a practical inversion of priorities. Almost all the discussion was not about Gaza anymore, but about the Board of Peace. And it quickly emerged that the Board of Peace was actually the key component of this entire initiative. You know, there was some talk about Gaza. Jared Kushner, as you may remember, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, had shown a PowerPoint presentation where, if you look at it from afar, it looked like some beautiful development in what used to be Dubai. But if you look at it closer, it was actually a digital dystopia of isolated digital parks with cashless economies, so that every financial transaction could be closely monitored, where people needed needed to produce biometric information practically to say good morning to their spouses in the morning, and a kind of dystopian control that even Orwell would have had difficulty recognizing. But in any case, the key issue in Davos was presentation of the Board of Peace, which consisted of 3 layers. The first was the Board of Peace itself, which consists of government. So heads of state or heads of government were invited to join it. If you were invited by Trump, you were there for free for a period of 3 years. For just $1 billion, a real steal, you could make your membership permanent. And if you were not invited, but wanted to be invited, that also would cost you only the small sum of $1 billion. All, of course, checks made out to Donald J. Trump. And among the people invited to become part of the Board of Peace was none other than Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. As one analyst said, inviting Netanyahu to join the Board of Peace is a bit like inviting Jeffrey Epstein to join the board of UNICEF. But it happened. Below that, you have what's called the Board of Peace Executive Committee. And this consists of a number of people, primarily Americans, Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, who I think is the real Secretary of State in the Trump administration. Then you have his assistant, Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner, a few others, Tony Blair, of course, because, you know, what is a moral failing without Tony Blair? And then the former Bulgarian minister and diplomat, the former UN diplomat as well, Nikolai Mladenov. And then you have this body called the National Committee for the Administration of the Gaza Strip, composed exclusively of Palestinians, led by an individual named Ali Shaath, a former Palestinian Authority deputy minister, if I'm not mistaken, someone who appears to have a solid reputation as a professional, as a technocrat, as a nonpartisan professional. And you take that together with the name of this group, the National Committee for the Administration of the Gaza Strip, and you think you're actually dealing with a Palestinian administration. But that is a name only, because the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza Strip can't do anything national, it can't do anything committee, it can't do anything administrative without the express permission of Nikolai Mladenov, acting on behalf of the Board of Peace Executive Committee, which is appointed by the Board of Peace President, Donald John Trump. In other words, it exists outside any existing Palestinian national or administrative framework. All its powers and authorities are derived from and subject to the Board of Peace. So what is the broader objective here? I'm sure that there are people involved in this initiative, probably including Trump himself, who would like to see all these proposals and PowerPoints and so on about the Gaza Strip actually be implemented and even succeed. But the people controlling reality on the ground are not Nikolai Mladenov. It's not the National Committee for the Administration of the Gaza Strip, whose members haven't even received Israeli permission to visit the Gaza Strip. It's Israel and its military. And it's quite clear, I think, also following from what my colleagues, my three colleagues said earlier, that Israel's strategic objective remains the removal of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Israel learned during the past 2 years that it cannot just expel these people because of objections from the Arab states, primarily Egypt, but what it can do is ensure that there is no reconstruction, that humanitarian aid continues to be obstructed, that there is no ceasefire. And that's essentially what we've had since October. Bombings have been a daily reality. Israel has failed to fulfill any of its commitments under that agreement. And the result is that we will have a situation similar to that which we had in Syria during the 2010s. The Syrian government never grabbed people to put them on trucks and buses and ship them to Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. No, the conditions of life became so intolerable for the average Syrian that they started leaving in growing numbers as individuals, as families, or even as groups, without there ever having been a formal government decision to expel the population. And that's what we're dealing with here, ensuring that the Gaza Strip continues to remain unfit for human habitation and that Palestinians begin leaving as a result. Now, just a few more points. As far as the Board of Peace is concerned, as I indicated, is a much bigger project than the Gaza Strip. I think the Gaza Strip was the entry point. As we've seen with so many other things, whether it's repression of free speech, suppressing demonstrations, and so on, Western governments always find it easy to change reality, to limit rights using Palestine because they can get powerful support for doing so. And once they've managed to do that, then you can begin to apply the precedent to other things. So the Board of Peace has set itself up essentially as an alternative to the organization that has since 1945 been charged with maintaining international peace and security, the United Nations, as a kind of rival, because it has already said that it has the authority to engage with any other international conflict. Will it seek to eliminate the UN? No, but it hopes to make the UN simply irrelevant, and the UN is, of course, helping mightily in this endeavor. And the Board of Peace, it's important to understand, is essentially subject to the discretion of a single individual. It cannot take a single decision without the express personal approval of Donald Trump. I mean, you know, even corporations don't work in that way. And I have to say, it's important to point out that a large measure of responsibility for the state of affairs must be borne by those who gave this entire project international legitimacy through the relevant UN Security Council resolution, I think it was 2803, including a permanent member that, if I'm not mistaken, it goes by the name of France. It was a very unusual Security Council resolution. In contrast to all others, it did not have preambles. It did not refer to previous resolutions on the topic, delineating authority, rights, and so on. It simply said, Trump good, do what you want. That's really essentially what happened. It authorized the Board of Peace without even specifying what that board is. I think the only restriction it put was that it would have to be renewed in 2027. And this is, you know, you spoke earlier about, Professor Schabas, about precedents from the 1930s. This is the definition of appeasement, of thinking that if you simply give this very powerful and threatening man everything he wants, that somehow he'll spare you. Well, the result, of course, is what's currently happening in Iran. And then after this resolution, the Europeans refused to formally join the Board of Peace because they insisted that its role be limited to the Gaza Strip. But then they actually participated in the meeting that was held in Washington a few weeks ago. So having one foot in and one foot out is not really going to work. The good news is that the Board of Peace is so closely tied to the person of Trump that I don't see how it can survive him. In other words, once he is removed from the scene, it's difficult to imagine that this Board of Peace will continue under a different guise, you know, with J.D. Vance or whoever as a leader. I just don't see it happening. It's too much of a personal vanity project to continue without him, in my personal view. And the better news is that even while he remains, people are already disassociating themselves from it. In response to the war of aggression that the United States is leading against Iran, Indonesia, which had in principle committed 8,000 troops to help police the Gaza Strip, has indicated that it is no longer participating in the Board of Peace. So, in conclusion, we're at a fork in the road. On the one side, you have the most powerful forces on earth seeking to replace the corpus of international law, of the norms and values that have governed international relations, international institutions themselves. They want to replace them with the law of the jungle, or preferably no law at all. On the other, you have a number of states, a number of institutions, such as the Hague Group, who are fighting for the principle that international law is only meaningful if it applies to everyone equally, and that it is only meaningful if impunity is replaced with accountability. This is not going to be an easy struggle, but it is essentially the powerful against the many, and therefore it is a far from concluded contest, and it is also one in which each of us has a role to play. Thank you very much.